They said owls are wise, but nothing could prepare her for the night she lost everything. The tree had stood for over 100 winters. High among its branches, wrapped in carefully woven twigs and feathers, her nest had become more than a shelter. It was a promise that life would continue, that softness could survive even in the sharpest winds. And for a brief time it did. Her 3 tiny owlets had just opened their eyes. She had named them in silence, one for the moon, one for the wind, and one for the stillness between. That evening the sky shifted without warning. Clouds swirled in like angry ghosts. Rain didn't fall, it attacked. Lightning cracked the horizon, and before she could stretch her wings to cover them, the nest tore open. A branch snapped, feathers scattered, and just like that, silence. She searched until her wings ached, cried into the wind until her voice broke. But the night took what it wanted, and morning brought no answers. The tree still stood, but the nest was gone, and with it, every beat of her heart. She perched there every dusk, returning to the place where once there had been warmth, now only emptiness. No one watched her mourn. No one marked her loss. The forest moved on, unaware that something sacred had been undone. But grief didn't hollow her out. It did something stranger. It made space. It started as a whisper, not from the wind, not from memory, but from something living. She had returned out of habit more than hope, wings trembling as they clutched the branch that had once held her world. But that night, one unlike the others, she paused, head tilted, ears alert. There it was again, a sound, barely more than breath, a tremble of life against the cold bark. Tucked into a hollow hidden by storm-tossed leaves lay a single owlet, not hers. Its feathers were damp, its eyes wide with fear and hunger. Abandoned, forgotten, just like she had been. She could have flown away. She could have convinced herself it wasn't her burden to bear. But something inside her, the same instinct that once built a nest from nothing, rose up again. She stepped closer, slowly, no fanfare, no call, only presence. The owlet flinched, then stilled. It didn't know her scent, didn't know her warmth, but it recognized safety. And in that hollow beneath the broken tree where she had lost everything, something began again. Not a replacement, not a rescue, a choice. She fed it, sheltered it, not with the same rhythm as before. This was slower, gentler. Grief made her cautious, but not closed. And as the days passed, the little one's eyes began to follow hers. Its wings grew stronger, its fear faded, and somewhere between nightfall and moonrise, they stopped being strangers. They became a pair, not of blood, but of bond. The kind not written in blood or built by instinct, but chosen in the quiet aftermath of loss. She taught the owlet how to move through the darkness, not just through flight, but through silence, through stillness, through listening. And the little one in turn gave her something no one else could. Purpose, not the old one, not the mother she had been, but the one she was now, wiser, wearier, but still willing to try. They hunted under moonlight, one above, one below. They learned each other's rhythm. She no longer searched the sky for what was taken, only scanned the earth for what was still here. He no longer flinched at the wind, only tucked closer beneath her wing, and slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when, the hollow was no longer a place of mourning. It was home. The forest never told their story. No one carved their names into bark. No one sang of their bond. But sometimes when the wind moved just right, it carried their silence farther than any song could reach. Because love like that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. It just needs to be given. And so she gave, not because she had to, but because someone had once done the same for her, waited in the stillness, offered warmth, stayed when everything else had vanished. She didn't save the owlet. They saved each other. Not with grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but in the smallest moments. The shared warmth in a frozen night, the rustle of feathers as one returned to the branch before the other, the silent understanding that no one had to be alone again. It was in the way she no longer flew too far from the tree, in case he woke and cried, in the way he began to perch just a little higher each day, imitating her posture, her patience, her quiet strength. The world beyond the forest went on, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding in the shadows. But beneath that battered old tree, something rare was taking root. Not just survival, but healing. Not just memory, but meaning. She was no longer the same mother who had once named her owlets after the wind and moon. That grief still lived in her, yes, but it had softened. It no longer clawed. It no longer paralyzed. Instead, it became a kind of compass, a reminder of how far she had flown, how deep she could love, how much she still had to give. And he, once a forgotten orphan with no nest, no name, no future, now flew with a purpose stitched into every feather. He didn't belong to anyone by blood, but he belonged, fully, fiercely, and in a world that often forgets the small and broken, that was everything. So they stayed, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Because in a world where everything had once been taken from them, this bond was something they had chosen, not out of desperation, not to fill an empty space, but because they saw something in each other that asked to be trusted. And day after day, trust became familiarity. Familiarity became comfort, and comfort, in time, became love. Not the loud kind, not the kind with declarations and promises, but the kind that simply shows up quietly again and again until showing up becomes a part of who you are. She no longer flew just to hunt. She flew with purpose, always returning, always watching. And he no longer waited with fear. He waited with knowing that someone would come back, that even in silence, he was never forgotten. Their movements began to echo each other. The way she turned her head when danger passed, the way he tucked his wings when the wind shifted, mirrors in motion. Not taught, just absorbed, just felt. And through seasons that came and went, through storms that tried again to break what had only just begun, they endured, together. Not against nature, but within it. They adapted. He grew. She softened. The forest no longer frightened him, and the wind no longer broke her. They weren't what they had been. They were something new, a pair not meant to be, yet perfectly formed. No nest could contain what they had become. No branch could name it. No rule of instinct or species or logic could explain it. It simply was. A bond beyond blood, built in the ruins of sorrow, shaped by patience, and carried on wings that had once flown alone. And even as time stretched on, even as the pup became strong enough to fly further, even as the world opened wide, he still returned. Not because he was lost, but because he had been found. And she, once broken, once silent, now watched the skies not with longing, but with peace. Because home had never been a place. It had been a heart, and she had given it, fully, freely, and with no expectation of return. But return came anyway, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Not because he owed her anything, not because he was taught to stay, but because in her presence he had discovered something no storm could destroy. A place where he was not just alive, but safe, seen, and significant. And when you find that kind of sanctuary, you don't measure it by time or distance. You measure it by how you feel the moment you return, and the quiet way your heart stops searching. He flew far now, testing the stretch of his wings, tracing new paths across the sky. But there was a rhythm to his journey, an invisible tether that pulled him back. Not out of habit, but out of memory. Memory of warmth in the cold, stillness in chaos, and a heartbeat that once slowed to match his. That kind of closeness doesn't fade with flight. It deepens with distance, because it was never about proximity. It was about presence. And she, older now, feathers tinged with the softness of time, waited without waiting. Not with expectation, but with understanding. Because some bonds don't demand to be proven daily. They simply are. They survive absence. They outlive loss. They become part of the land, the sky, the silence between fluttering wings. Their story was never written in a single moment. It was built in fragments, night after night, gesture after gesture, breath after breath. It didn't begin with birth or end with death. It existed outside of reason, beyond nature's design, and perhaps that's why it mattered more. Because it wasn't supposed to exist, but it did, because they chose it. Every day, every season, every return. And in that choice, something eternal was born. Something that reminded even the stars, even the wind, even the oldest trees, that love, when freely given and freely received, becomes the kind of legacy that nothing, not time, not loss, not even silence, can ever undo. Because when something is born from grief but nurtured in love, it does more than survive, it transforms. It seeps into the very marrow of what came after, shaping every silent moment, every returning wing beat, every glance toward the sky that once held nothing but storms. Their bond became more than memory. It became atmosphere. The kind of presence that lingers long after the body's gone. The kind of truth that needs no telling, because those who come after can feel it before they even understand it. In the hollows of trees, the echo of their rhythm remained. In the hush between two distant wings, the story played itself over again, not in words but in action. And somehow, across seasons, across generations, across the ever-shifting sky, what they had built remained, quiet, unseen, but real. Because that's the thing about love that chooses to stay. It doesn't end where the story does. It echoes. It teaches without speaking. It calls without commanding. It roots itself so deep in another that even if the world forgets their names, it remembers their shape. The shape of two lost beings who didn't give up, who didn't move on, who didn't let go. Not because they had to, but because they knew what it meant to hold on. And when you know that, really know it, you don't run from silence anymore. You rest in it. You breathe in it. You leave a space in your life where something unexpected and wild and gentle might land. And stay. They never asked the world to notice, but the world noticed anyway. And in 1,000 unseen ways, in the rustle of leaves, in the pause before flight, in the choice to return, they are remembered, not with monuments, not with songs, but with something softer, a quiet loyalty, a love that never needed words to be heard. Because some bonds speak through breath, through nearness, through the way two lives begin to move as one without ever asking to. Their story was not told with noise, not declared with boldness. It was felt. Felt in the way the air grew still when they were together. In how time slowed each dusk, she waited, not with longing, but with trust. In how he always returned, not for protection, not for guidance, but because her presence had become the compass his wings listened to. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were no perfect days. Storms still came. Nights were still long. But something had shifted. They had found shelter, not just under branches or inside hollows, but inside each other's rhythms. That kind of connection doesn't ask for permanence. It just asks to be honored, moment by moment, with the courage to stay when leaving might seem easier. Others might have seen only an owl and a foundling, but those who knew the silence well, those who understood how grief reshapes you, could see it clearly. They were not mother and child, not rescuer and rescued. They were something rarer, two broken hearts that didn't try to fix each other, just chose not to leave. And through that choice, healing happened. Not loudly, not suddenly, but fully. Their legacy lived not in what they built, but in what they rebuilt, within themselves, within each other. And that kind of rebuilding, that kind of love, doesn't just survive storms. It teaches the sky how to clear, how to part the clouds not with force, but with faith that something brighter will follow the darkest hours. And that lesson, taught not by voices but by presence, traveled far beyond the limbs of their tree. Other creatures noticed, not in the way humans do, with analysis and naming, but in the way nature understands quiet constancy. In the way nearby branches held nests just a little tighter, or how younger wings tucked closer in the wind. Her story, his story, became part of the forest's breath. No one wrote it down, no one drew a map, but still the path remained, a route carved by silence and flight, by loss and return. And those who found themselves alone, those who had once been shattered or set adrift, could sense it when they passed through. As if the air there held something different, softer, truer, a kind of whisper, You are not alone. Someone stayed, and because they did, you can too. That's what legacies like theirs do. They don't echo loudly, they ripple slowly, through time, through space, through hearts that have forgotten how to open. And sometimes on the quietest nights, when the wind is still and the moon is watching, that ripple grows strong enough to start something new again, somewhere else, in another broken wing, in another empty hollow, in another soul still searching for a place to land. Because the bond they built wasn't just theirs, it was a permission, passed on through example, to begin again. To offer love not as a transaction, not as a reward, but as a gift with no expectation. And that gift outlived them. It always does. Because when love is given freely, when it's nurtured not in perfection, but in patience, it doesn't end with the ones who first carried it. It becomes the beginning of everything that follows. Because once love proves itself real in the absence of obligation, it leaves a trail. Not one you can see, but one you can feel. In the spaces where sorrow once ruled, something gentler takes root. In places that were once hollowed out by grief, warmth begins to collect. And suddenly what felt like the end becomes a seed. And seeds in time grow into shelter for others who have yet to understand what safety feels like. The story of the owl and the orphan wasn't just a moment. It was a quiet revolution, one that didn't need applause, didn't require recognition. It asked only for presence, for the courage to stay, for the bravery to offer comfort, even when the future was uncertain. And in doing so, they lit a path through the dark that others could follow, even if they never knew who lit it first. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting what was lost, not pretending the pain never happened, but honoring it, transforming it, and handing something softer to the ones who come next. A nest rebuilt from broken twigs, a warmth shared with wings that didn't come from your own body, a stillness that says, "I'm here," without needing anything in return. Their bond wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it shifted the air around them. It changed the way the forest breathed, and that breath carried forward into new trees, into new nights, into the small and sacred places where love, once planted, never truly disappears. Because love like that doesn't just leave a mark, it creates a way forward. And those who follow it, whether they fly or crawl or barely move at all, find that the path is already softened for them, already waiting. Because someone stayed long enough to make it real. Long enough for fear to settle, for silence to soften, for a trembling body to believe in safety again. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment when everything changed. It was the slow unfolding of trust, the quiet layering of comfort, like feathers pressed gently into a new nest, one that hadn't existed before, but was built stroke by stroke through presence alone. And in that space they built together, something extraordinary took shape. Not because it was planned, not because it was easy, but because it was chosen, over and over, day after day, even when no one was watching. That's the kind of love that endures, not because it's invincible, but because it refuses to leave when things get hard. It bends, it waits, it learns the rhythms of another soul and says, "I'll match you. I'll meet you where you are. You don't have to be anything but here." In a world that moves fast and forgets easily, their stillness became sacred. A quiet refusal to rush, a gentle defiance of abandonment, a statement, not in words but in presence. You matter enough to stay for. And for the one who had been left behind before, that was everything. He learned, not through lessons, but through experience, that love isn't always loud, but it's always felt. He began to carry that lesson in the way he moved, in the way he rested, in the way he looked back each time he took flight just to make sure she was still there. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude. And she, once a mother with empty wings, became something more. A symbol, a story. A whisper passed down from branch to branch that said, "Even in loss, you can love again. Even in silence, you can be heard." They had rewritten the language of survival, turned it into one of devotion. And devotion, once real, never fades. It becomes part of the landscape. It weaves itself into the rhythm of the wind, into the creak of the trees, into the way certain places simply feel warmer, even when no one is there. That kind of love doesn't demand to be seen to exist. It leaves its trace in the pauses, in the stillness, in the choices made without witness. And because of that, it endures where so many other things do not. Long after their feathers grew silver with time, long after his wings beat confidently across skies he once feared, their bond remained. Not as something they clung to, but as something they had grown into. It wasn't a rescue story, it was a becoming, a transformation shaped by presence and patience, by the sacred act of staying close when it would have been easier to fly away. Others may never know their names, but they will know their legacy, in the way a lonely heart finds the courage to trust again, in the way silence between two creatures can become louder than words, in the way survival, when shared, becomes connection, and connection, when nurtured, becomes a kind of light, small, flickering, but unbreakable. She no longer needed to protect him, and he no longer needed her to prove she cared. What they had built didn't need defending, it simply lived, between them, around them, beyond them. And in the hush of twilight, when the forest quieted and the world held its breath, you could still feel it, their story, still unfolding in the spaces they once touched. Because love like that doesn't end, it doesn't fade, it becomes part of the sky. Not in the way storms leave behind scars, but in the way dawn gently returns each day without ever needing permission. Their story lived in that rhythm, in the subtle shift between dark and light, in the quiet promise that even after the deepest night, something steady and warm will come back. That's what their bond had become. Not a loud proclamation, not a tale to be retold with fanfare, but a constant presence, like sunlight filtering through the trees long after the clouds have gone. And in that presence, others found courage. Not all at once, not with clarity, but with something softer. The courage to wait, to sit beside the broken, to offer warmth without expectation. The courage to believe that choosing to love, even when it seems unlikely, even when it makes no sense, can be its own kind of miracle. They didn't mean to teach the forest how to heal, but they did. Every time he returned, every time she opened her wings just enough for him to nestle close, every time they chose stillness over escape, the ground remembered their footsteps, the air carried their memory, the stars blinked differently above the tree that held them, and in the hush that followed, after the flights, after the storms, after the long, quiet winters, something lingered, something no one could quite name, but everyone could feel, and it felt like love. Not the kind written in stories or spoken in grand declarations, but the kind that grows in silence, in the moments no one sees. The kind that doesn't need language because it is language. A glance, a breath, a heartbeat slowing because it senses safety. It was the kind of love that didn't begin with intention but with instinct. Born of survival, then softened by presence, and finally nurtured by choice. He had once lived in a world defined by loss, a space where nothing stayed and everything eventually left. But here, with her, he began to unlearn that law. Every time she opened her wings, not to fly away, but to shelter him. Every time she tilted her head just slightly to make room. Every time she blinked slowly in his direction, not to judge, but to say, "You are seen. You are safe." He started to believe in permanence. It was slow, the way trust took root in his bones. Like thawing earth after a brutal winter, reluctant at first, unsure, cracking in places, but then gradually letting warmth in. She didn't ask anything from him. Not obedience, not gratitude, just presence. That was enough. And so he gave it, clumsily at first, with hesitation, but then more and more willingly. He'd sit beside her long after the forest quieted for the night. Sometimes they wouldn't even touch, just breathe the same cold air, feel the same slow wind, watch the same moon rise over the same canopy. And that was connection, simple, sacred, irreplaceable. Seasons changed. The trees around them shifted color, shed their leaves, grew them again. The world didn't wait for them, and yet, within their space, It felt like time had slowed down. He grew stronger, wiser, not because he was taught, but because he was trusted. And she softened in ways even she hadn't expected. In her chest, once hollowed by grief, something fluttered again. There were no calendars, no anniversaries, no names scratched into bark. But the forest remembered their days, and so did the wind. And when storms came, as they always do, their tree stood strong, not because it had never bent, but because it had been held steady from within, from the bond that had anchored itself deep, unseen by most, but stronger than anything that swayed above. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they didn't fear it, because hope, once returned, makes room, not for certainty, but for courage. And courage, they had learned, is sometimes just the willingness to remain, to witness, to offer warmth when the world turns cold. And that was enough, more than enough. Because when love is real, truly real, it makes everything else possible again. It doesn't fix what was broken, doesn't erase what was lost, but it carves out new ground where nothing was meant to grow. It stitches the impossible together with thread made of patience and presence. And in their quiet world beneath the canopy, where the sun slanted just so through the leaves, where their bodies cast overlapping shadows that danced in the late afternoon breeze, they became proof. Proof that survival is only the beginning. That true healing begins the moment we stop guarding our wounds and start offering them as bridges to someone else. He had no name for what they shared, no story to compare it to. Only the feeling, steady and whole, that her presence meant he could finally rest. That he didn't have to understand everything to be safe. He didn't have to be strong or useful or perfect. He just had to be, and she would stay. And that, perhaps more than food or shelter or safety, was what made him grow. His fur thickened, his eyes cleared. His small frame, once trembling from cold and memory, began to carry its own weight. He didn't know the moment it happened, but she did. She saw it in the way he walked, no longer with the hesitant steps of someone waiting to be abandoned, but with the calm, confident stride of one who had been claimed not with chains but with care. And her? She too began to shift, not back to who she had been before, but into someone even softer. Stronger, yes, but in a different way. Not the fierce protection of a mother with something to lose, but the quiet certainty of a soul who had given everything, lost everything, and still chosen to give again. Together they became something the forest didn't quite have a word for. Not family, not companions. Something between instinct and miracle. Something rare, something sacred. They were no longer just survivors, they were a story. One written in glances, in warmth, in breath shared under moonlight. One told in how she waited, in how he stayed, in how they never needed to speak to understand. And others noticed, at first from a distance, a young bird with a torn wing resting longer than usual on a nearby branch. A fox kit lingering at the edge of the glade. Then more. Creatures who sensed that something different lived here. Not a danger, not dominance, but a promise. That this was a place where hurt could exist without being hunted. Where loneliness could enter and not be devoured. Where fear could rest beside love without being asked to disappear. Their world had become a sanctuary, not one with walls, but one with space. Space for breath, space for grief, space for becoming. And in that space, life didn't just continue, it deepened, became richer, more honest, more brave. Because once you've known the kind of love that doesn't leave, you begin to offer it back. First in small ways, a longer pause, a softer tone, a shared silence, then in bigger ones. Choosing to stay when flight is easier, choosing to see when turning away would be simpler, choosing to believe that even in the ache, something beautiful is possible again. And they chose it, not because they were bound by obligation, not because nature told them to, but because something in their hearts had rewritten the rules. They had discovered that love, when chosen freely and nurtured daily, doesn't fade. It doesn't weaken with time. It grows roots so deep that even the fiercest winds can't shake it. It embeds itself into the very landscape where it was born. And that's what they had become. a landmark of tenderness in a world that too often forgot how powerful quiet care can be. Seasons circled, and with each turn, they stayed. Through rains that soaked the earth and winds that howled through the branches, through cold snaps that made breath visible in the air, and heat waves that slowed every living thing to stillness. They stayed. Not out of survival anymore, but because they had made something worth staying for. The world around them bent gently to accommodate their story. Trees leaned subtly toward their chosen tree. Grass grew thicker where they often rested. Even the distant calls of other creatures seemed to hush slightly when they passed, as if the forest itself was listening. And they weren't the only ones who changed. A pair of orphan fledglings once wandered too close, frightened and disoriented, wings still too soft to carry them far. He was the first to approach, not bold but calm, unafraid, and she followed, circling from above, before landing beside them. They didn't take the young ones in, not in the way humans might understand, but they didn't chase them off either. They made space, they waited, and gradually the fledglings began to mimic their quiet rhythm, perching in nearby branches, sleeping under the same tree, listening, watching, learning what it meant to live without fear of being alone. It wasn't just healing anymore. It had become legacy, a way of being passed silently from heart to heart. And though the world beyond their forest never knew their names, it felt their impact. Because when love like theirs exists, it echoes. It ripples outward, touching things it never physically meets. Someone miles away might pause for no reason, just to feel the wind on their face. A child might pick up an injured creature instead of walking past. A heart might soften where it was once closed, because somewhere, deep in the woods, love made a home, and that home gave others permission to hope again. What they had built could never be measured, could never be fully seen, but it could be felt in the hush of morning fog, in the stillness of starlit skies, in the deep breath someone takes before daring to stay. They hadn't meant to change the world, but they had, not with noise, not with power, but with presence, and that was enough. They hadn't meant to change the world, but they did, simply by refusing to abandon what mattered. And now, long after the first moment their paths crossed, their story remains. Not in a single place, but scattered like seeds. In the hush between footsteps, in the pause before flight, in the choice to return when everything says walk away. The owl still watches the clearing, sometimes alone, sometimes not, but always with the same stillness in her chest, the kind that comes from knowing you gave your heart to something that didn't ask for it, but cherished it all the same. And he, once just a lost soul beneath the canopy, now moves with certainty. Not because he belongs to anyone, but because someone once made space for him to belong at all. The bond they built didn't fade. It shaped the silence. It became the breath of the forest itself. And long after their story stops being told, it will continue. In the decisions of others who dare to love the unlikely, who choose kindness before certainty, who offer sanctuary even when they're still healing themselves. Because in the end, the world doesn't change in grand declarations. It changes in the quiet moments when someone stays, when someone sees, when someone believes there's still something worth saving. If this story moved you, stay, not just here, but in the world. Stay kind, stay open, and maybe stay for someone else too.